Build Your Business listeners. This is Matt Reynolds, your host for the podcast, and you are listening to what we are calling the legacy episodes. And really, these are the pre-episodes that really led to this podcast, the Build Your Business podcast. This is really my life's work and my brother's life's work in building your business. And so they were originally published in the Barbell Logic podcast as part of the Principles or Coaching Success series, but really touch on similar topics to the Build Your Business podcast: how to improve your productivity, how to set and accomplish your goals, deprioritize urgent tasks, to focus on what is most important to you, and most importantly, to become a better person and leader and business owner overall. I'm proud to bring you these podcasts. Again, many years of life's work, several years of podcasts, and several decades of business ownership. Hope you enjoy them and learn from them. You're listening to Barbell Logic, brought to you by Barbell Logic Online Coaching, where each week we take a systematic walk through strength training and the refining power of voluntary hardship. Welcome to the Barbell Logic podcast. I am here again for another Principles episode with my brother, Chris Reynolds.
Hello.
I'm coming from the Midwest. You're out there on the East Coast in Boston. And, I saw a tweet this week, and I wanted to talk about it, that the most sought after job skill, life skill, personality skill for the foreseeable future is the ability to de-escalate. And when I read it, I sort of hate to admit this, by the way, I was like, that's what Chris is good at. You're very good at de-escalation. Far better than I am. Really, is the Principles, do you feel like the Principles series is really just, we just talk about all the things that are important to both of us, but I'm shitty at and you're good at? Is that what these things are? Is that what the Principles?
I think you're driving it enough that you're like, hey, let me get in your head a little bit. I think if we did the reverse role and I was like, there are all sorts of areas where you shine far more than I do. It just happens to be that in a lot of these topics. Yeah, I'm good at it. That sounds great. You've always been very good at de-escalation. And again, we've been careful about what we talk about on the show with everything that's going on in the country right now. We want to continue to stay as apolitical as we can. Certainly, the ability to de-escalate in some really heated situations is so incredibly needed right now in our culture. However, this is a skill for people that must be learned. And I have watched you over the course of your life learn how to de-escalate first among your friends and among your family members, and then among the people that you worked for, and then the people who worked underneath you. I've watched you de-escalate with children very well, right? You have 3 kids, 2 boys who, love to murder each other on a daily basis. And so you spend a lot of time in de-escalation mode. And I just wanted to talk about it a little bit today, like what that looks like to you and how much you actually think about it and have worked on it versus how much of it feels natural. Man, I've thought about this so much over the course of my life. It is true that I am particularly good at de-escalation.
I like that on most of the most recent podcasts, you also come across as incredibly arrogant.
I should come across as arrogant because I am to some degree.
I think you're far less arrogant than I am, and yet I love it when you're like, I am particularly good at this thing.
Yeah, I don't think false humility is a thing that I value. So if I think I'm good at something, I'll let you know that I'm good at it. And otherwise, there's a bunch of stuff I'm terrible at. So we can have whole podcasts.
Actually, that'd make a really good future Principles series is things that are important to us that we're really awful at. These are principles that would make a good show. Okay, so de-escalation. Where did this kind of start? What are your thoughts there?
I actually feel like to talk about where it started, you have to start with a little bit of a story.
part of this is, when we grew up under what I would consider were fairly stressful circumstances for our family because we didn't know it. I mean, we talked about this, I think, in the last podcast. We had a good time. We were out playing baseball and hanging out and, doing kid stuff. But the truth is, our father was in the middle of a major career change from being an engineer to being a pastor. And that life was a life that was very, very, very difficult. And I understand now as an adult just how difficult and stressful it was. I did not understand it.
By the way,
as a
I
kid.
found out a few years ago that Dad's salary in 1986 as a pastor was $8,000. That was his annual salary. So to put that into perspective, I don't know exactly what that is in today's dollars, but it ain't 40 grand, right? 1986, $8,000.
We were barely scraping by, and so anyway, the reason I bring that up is just because as a kid, I think it's fair to say, while Dad was an exceptional father, especially in his later years. In his early years, he was very, very volatile. He's a volatile person. And we learned later that a lot of that was related to his own anxiety that he struggled with for his entire life. Our grandmother struggled with for her entire life. And thank you, Pops, you passed that along to us. So, yeah, I didn't really learn about it until the stress in my life became, to the point that it was overwhelming to me. And then I could really relate to it considerably better. But I think because Dad was such a volatile character in my early life, it was really a way to cope with stress. De-escalation was a weapon for me, or maybe better stated, it was a shield.
Yeah.
I figured out very, very young that in order to feel safe in our house, I had to figure out how to de-escalate as quickly as possible. And so I think, Matt and I, we grew up in the same house for a very long period of time in the same bedrooms, right? I mean, like we had bunk beds and we were in the same room. But I think because of my personality, and we've talked about this a little bit, that I'm a very, very, I'm a highly sensitive person, or otherwise known as an introvert. I'm just collecting insane amounts of information from what's going on in the environment around me. So I think things that were maybe only a minor threat, or maybe no threat at all to someone who doesn't feel that way, felt like a major threat to me. So I had to figure out how to de-escalate Dad very, very quickly. And, you think about from his perspective, it was, struggling to make ends meet, dealing with phone calls at 3:00 in the morning. Somebody's died. He's got to go. He's a pastor. He's got to go show up and take care of it. I mean, just chaos all the time. And then I've got 3 little kids. I know what kind of chaos they can create on their own. So it's just chaos on top of chaos. And I understand that now as an adult, and certainly don't hold that against him, but it gave me an opportunity to figure out how to get into a space where I could feel safe. And the way that I did that was when Dad was particularly amped up about something, I could play him like a fiddle. And we talked about it in later years on our fishing trips. And and Dad would even know that I was doing it. Dad told me, he's like, I usually knew you were playing me, but it was nice to be played. I was like, okay, good. So I think a combination of a personality trait in there that, was a requirement in order to master some of those skills early in life. But then, man, they became so valuable, and I built on them. So as time went on, and it was, related to my friends, it was related to, school, later to work, later to my employees, whatever. I continued to read and try to refine that skill because it did become a skill that I felt like was so valuable. I mean, you think about the circumstances where things are starting to go off the rails. And if you have the ability to bring it back from total destruction, well, yeah, that's a pretty valuable thing to be able to do.
It's always been a pretty valuable thing to do, but it feels like an extra valuable thing today, right? Where it sort of feels like everyone is volatile. no matter where you are, right? Like no matter where you land politically or religiously, or like where all this, but the combination of all of the things that have occurred, especially in 2020, in the year 2020, has sort of made everybody kind of walking on kind of thin ice or pins and needles, or they're, heads on a swivel all the time.
Yeah.
And the ability to de-escalate in those situations, I don't know that there's ever been a time certainly not in this century, where it was more valuable. It's incredibly valuable. And by the way, I just want to say too, I don't believe this comes naturally to you. And here's why I say that. I probably remember better than you do that, because I was older, that when you were really young, you were very stubborn. And there were some really intense discipline sessions with mom and dad.
Yep.
And where you just stood your ground and you're like, I don't care how many times you spank me or how many, what sort of discipline you hand down, I will not give in. And at some point you figured out how to play the game.
Probably because of it. Right. I mean, there's a particular one of those episodes you and I are both thinking of, and I won't get into the specifics. But I will say that I think that as a little kid, especially if you've been through that, you find other coping mechanisms. You find other tools so that you don't find yourself on the other end of that type of discipline. It comes down to that.
It's like to be trite. It's like the Dr. Phil thing. Like, how's that working out for you? How's being stubborn working out for you? You just got 37 spankings in a row. Like, well, that's not what I wanted. Well, can you play the game a little better than that? I've had this conversation with my kids. I'm sure your kids are the same way. They're so different. My youngest knows how to play the game. She totally gets it.
Yeah.
And my oldest is so fiercely independent and stubborn. And by the way, and a great leader. I mean, if she's in a group of teenagers, like she's the lead, it's pretty clear who's leading the pack. It's my kid. But she doesn't know how to de-escalate. She doesn't know how to play the game. She'll stand her ground no matter what. And so, she's grounded every other day. And the younger one knows, and the older one, it just incites anger in the older one to watch the younger one play the game and play the, like, I can be sweet and I can be kind and I can be, and we just tell our kids, much in the same way Dad did you in the later years, like, listen, if you want to play me for de-escalation, I'll let you do that all day. If you want to play me to make me more stressed out and make my face turn purple in stress, like, you're going to lose that game. You will lose.
Right.
So
I think as I got older, so many of the things that I had put into play when I was young, I could kind of understand the mechanics of it a little better. And the more I would read about it and I would learn about, you start getting into a lot more complex situations. For example, we've talked about already, it's different the way you interact with your parents than the way you interact with your peers. And it's also different than the way that you interact with your employees. When you are the superior or whatever in that circumstance, all of those dynamics are different, but there are similar ways to approach it. And I think at the heart of the whole thing is there is definitely a bit of empathy that we've done a podcast talking about empathy. And I think empathy is a great place to start, because if you can imagine yourself in the other person's shoes, and it's not quite so black and white as I'm right and they're wrong, and I want to be right, and I care most about being right, not necessarily about ending this in the best possible way. You've just got to do that. You've got to be in a position where you can imagine what it would be like to be them. Now, usually what is causing the conflict is some difference in values or some totally different understanding about what occurred. Right. And I think you can find yourself in a situation where as quickly as possible, you have to change the conversation from being about me versus you to being about us versus the problem. If you can do that, the de-escalation takes care of itself. It's absolutely fascinating how quickly it occurs. You think about like what it would take for, I mean, most little kids can't do this, but if the parent, my oldest son actually is already pretty good at this. And he will from time to time say, we'll be in the middle of, Carter, why are you doing this? You've got to stop, whatever. And he'll say, guys, this is the problem that we're working on. We've got to deal with this together, figure it out. And I'm like, okay, I'm in, and now I'm being
where your youngest is the opposite. Not your youngest, sorry, your younger son.
Well, actually, my younger son has gotten quite a bit better. Like me, he's followed a very similar path, which is that hard-headedness, sort of, that intensity, but he shows a lot of emotional awareness. At the moment, my daughter will probably be the hardest one.
Funny. Yeah.
Along these paths.
Who's the youngest? And how old is she? She's turned 6, right?
She just turned 6.
Yeah. So, interesting, one of the relationships we haven't mentioned yet, which I think is the one that's taught me the most, is not in there is an authority figure and someone underneath them, but it's in my relationship with my wife where there isn't an authority figure. We are co-equals. Right. And in that situation, it really magnifies what the end goal is for both. Is the end goal to be right and to win? Or is the end goal reconciliation? Like, and for most people, for me, in the first 7 or 8 years of my marriage, the goal was to be right and to win. And then you learn. And I celebrated my 20th wedding anniversary just, last month before last. And it's because we've learned how to conflict well. My wife and I were always best friends. I mean, I've been super close with my wife since I was in the 8th grade, way before we were ever dating. We were friends. And to get into a cycle of we did great together 95% of the time. And then the 5% of the time we were in conflict, it went awful. Now, it wasn't like we weren't throwing shit at each other, like breaking vases in the house and stuff. It wasn't that, but it was just like we were both like refused to give in to the other. And when you recognize that in 99% of conflict, both sides actually think they're right. Occasionally, a truly depraved evil person knows they're wrong and on stubbornness alone will fight even though they know they're wrong, right? It's that I don't know if you watched the Lance Armstrong documentary. Have you watched it yet?
I don't think so.
Oh, you should watch it. It came out like the week after the Chicago Bulls one did. It's a 2-part series. That guy's a douche. Now, I love him. I mean, he's amazing. But that guy literally would incite drama about his innocence in PEDs while knowing that he was taking performance-enhancing drugs. Like we were against the rules, right? We got a problem there. Now, it was for millions and millions of dollars, so it's not like, what's weird is that occasionally you'll find the person who doesn't have that much on the line, and they're just like a sociopath and just they refuse to lose. Right. But when I chose in my marriage to decide like, hey, every conflict that I have in my marriage, I play some part in this. I may be 100% responsible. I may be 90% responsible. I may only be 10% responsible, but I'm something responsible. And when I take ownership and responsibility for the part that I play in that and expect nothing in return, not, hey, I'm sorry for the part I played in this. Now, don't you have something that you want to say to me? None of that. That's not de-escalation.
It doesn't work well.
Then the ultimate goal is actually reconciliation, not in winning. And so I think our marriages or our relationships with significant others can teach us probably more about this than anything. And then the next one for me is being a parent and understanding that I have basically complete authoritarian control over my kids if I want it. They're young enough, I control everything. But then I can also remember what it was like to be in their shoes. It wasn't that long ago.
Yeah, that's right.
And then you take those things because you interact in those situations more than any other, And you start to take those outside the familial relationships, and you say, okay, well, how do I handle this in work and business, in either with my boss, if you have bosses, or with my employees, if you have employees.
Right.
One thing for me that's been a big deal is I really struggle with even considering that there is a hierarchy in my business. I don't want there to be and I don't feel like I sit at the top. I don't act that way. And I know that it's there, and I know that there's a little something that changed, that a lot of these wonderful people who work for me, we were all just friends 5 years ago, and now, look, I'm the guy that owns the company and I'm the boss, but like it still feels the same to me. Now it may feel a little different to them.
Yeah.
But the key is that I still treat them like they're my peers and my friends and my coworkers, not my employees.
Right. Well, I think if you think about what causes conflict escalate, it is almost always at the base of it is the intention of both sides to win the argument. And I think if you imagine, it's always helpful for me to imagine what does that look like? What are you actually after? Because if what you're doing is you're trying to win by having, whoever's on the other side of your argument or whatever say, oh, you're right, you're right, I'm wrong, how many times has that ever happened, ever, in any conversation you've ever had with anyone, where you approached it, where you're on one side and they're on the other, and you're battling it out? It doesn't. No one is ever convinced that way. You might find out a month later that the more they stewed on it, that they maybe were convinced, possible. But more than likely, if what you want, if the outcome is to convince, then the way to approach it is just totally differently. And it's that we together are going to pursue, the answer on this. I got through some of this in my mid-20s or early 20s, I guess. I was on the opposite side of a majority view for where I lived from within a religious context. And I felt like a extreme outsider. And at first I wanted to convince people that I wasn't, something that they thought I was, evil or,
Sure.
bad person or something. And so I was always trying to convince people of that, and that didn't really work. And so the way that I ended up approaching it when people wanted to have that conversation is I would say, hey, look, here's some facts. Let's see how they fit into our worldview. And when you approach it that way, you're just, 2-3 people, however many are having the conversation, trying to discover the truth about something. And it's such an easier way to have a conversation. And that way everyone's open to change a little bit, move and grow in their understanding. And that's really the key to de-escalating.
Well, again, when you understand that the person on the other side actually thinks that they are right, morally right, they're passionate about it, right?
Yeah.
I think people tend to vilify the other side, and they're like, well, that person is wrong and evil and they're the villain, and so I must overtake them. But they think the same about you. They think they're the good guy, right? And one of the things that gives me hope in culture right now is that like you and I, we totally disagree about religion and politics. And we've never had a fight about either. And we've had great discussions about both. But when the goal is to hear out the other side, to try to put yourself in the other person's shoes or the other side's shoes, and to understand their worldview, where they're coming from. Like, this is the place where healing starts to begin, right? It's not about, I'm not trying to convince you to see my way in religion or politics. I'm trying to understand your way and figure out, like, well, how can we live together? And here's what's crazy. We're doing a podcast about a value system where our values are in alignment about 99.9%. And we disagree about religion and politics. So,
right. How's that possible?
Because we respect each other as humans. That's why.
That's right. And I think there's a barrier that can pop up, and this is where I think people can really, this is where a little bit of internal work can go a long way. So this is maybe homework for everybody if they're listening to the podcast. The main barrier that can show up in these types of conversations when it comes to de-escalation is feeling attacked. Okay. So the moment in which you feel attacked, and everybody knows what that feels like, when you have whatever physiological response you have, heart racing, gut tightening, whatever it is, knot in your stomach, whatever happens when you feel attacked, that is the worst barrier to de-escalating and the greatest way to just pour fuel on a fire. So in order to not feel attacked, I think there are a lot of tools that you can use. The first one is recognize that you do feel attacked. This is a feeling, right? There's nothing we can do about our feelings, but there's a lot we can do about the behavior in response to feelings. So when you feel it, you need to come up with some way to interrupt that. And the best way that I've found to interrupt it is to get a little bit of space, breathe a little bit and just give yourself some room. Anytime you feel like someone's attacking you, if you can give yourself, you don't have to respond, right? Like I think this is like the first thing that should be taught by the time you're in junior high, especially like, hey, if you ever feel like you're being attacked, you don't have to say anything in response. You can say, just a minute. I need a minute.
Sure.
Walk away for a little while, right? And take it down a notch. I think the other thing is we all know people who seem to feel attacked more often than other people. Like they feel attacked almost all the time. They're all the time being barraged with attack. And I think for those people, it is typically an issue of self-esteem and self-confidence. I think if your self-confidence is not where it needs to be, you will find yourself feeling attacked regularly because to some degree there's this voice in your head that's saying, you're not good enough,
and now this person is confirming that you're not good enough.
Right.
You know what? I've thought this all these years, and now this person they're making me feel like that's true.
They become the embodiment of this thing that you hate maybe about yourself. And I think there are several areas where we can work to make sure that the environment that we're navigating is one of mutual learning rather than one of a combative, experience.
I believe very strongly that emotion and reason lie on a spectrum on opposite ends. And that the more emotional you are, the less reason that you'll have, right? Now, I want to be clear about something. I don't think it's wrong to have emotion. I don't think it's wrong to be overcome with emotion. We're both pretty emotional guys. Like, one of the things that I think is sort of odd for us and that people who know us know that we're fairly emotional. We can get choked up about things. We can get, incredibly jubilant. And we could also be really crushed by stuff. However, I think one of the things that you and I share is that we don't tend to let those emotions drive our actions because we don't make decisions and push actions forward when we're in the middle of an emotionally heightened state. I don't think there's anything wrong with an emotionally heightened state. There's times when you need that. But that is not a great time to have a debate or try to reconcile with someone else when you're emotionally. It's okay to be that way, but then once you calm down and talk, and it's the same. We learn this. I've learned this in my marriage a lot. Like when we are in a conflict where both think that we're right, and we're emotional about it, then we have to do exactly what you said. We have to take a break. We have to take a time out. We have to we have to breathe, like for 10 minutes, 30 minutes, an hour. And then come back when the emotions die down and attack the problem with logic and reason in literally a Socratic method of doing the thing, right? The thing about the Socratic debate is that we're not debating each other in Socratic debate. We're working together to solve the problem. And while we may come up with different answers, it's okay. The goal together is to find the answer to the thing.
I mean, that's the only way to navigate such a complex world. And there's so much going on. I mean, right now, obviously, we're talking about so much heightened sense of emotions within the world, but certainly in the U.S. And I think this is a great time actually to practice. Like, so this is really for everybody, right? Like, one way to practice this is to find opposing views. We've talked about this before, and I think I've talked about it in almost every podcast, so I apologize. But find an opposing view from what you currently think and make yourself read up on it, right? To find a book that you've been told, by all the people in your group is like the worst possible book, like the worst perspective on something, and read it cover to cover. Now, you might be mad throughout the thing, and you might highlight and make all sorts of places like, this is crazy, and that's okay. But what's interesting is rarely will you find your way going through the entire book and having not learned something. You probably will get some perspective, and you will at least understand what the other side's perspective is. So I think this is a great time to dive in and start learning. And then the other element that I think is really useful is try having conversations with people that you know and love and trust where you disagree, right? Like, do that on purpose. Because one of the other things that I've noticed is I have a few people in my life that you just know, if we have a conversation about something where there's disagreement, and especially if it's got a strong emotional component, it's politics, it's religion, whatever, they are going to explode or die of a heart attack or something. Like, you just can't do it. And for every one of those people in my life that I'm aware of, I don't think they ever practice having conversations with people where they disagree. So, I mean, this is something you can practice. You can talk to people, you can talk to somebody and come from two different perspectives and watch closely for that heart starting to race a little bit, for your blood pressure to increase, your face to start turning red. Like, do that and engage in it, and notice that at the end of the conversation, the world doesn't end. You don't die. And usually you walk away learning something. Even if you vehemently disagree with the other viewpoint, you at least understand the other viewpoint better.
Yeah, that's a good wrap up for this. And I would just say that you don't have to fight the emotional, visceral reaction that you have to some of these things. That's okay. But I also think that is best practiced privately. And when it comes time to have the conversations, you have to keep your emotions in check in order to have a reasonable, logical discussion, which is what we all want to have. In order for us to have a reasonable discussion, we can't emotionally explode. We can't have that. Having emotional explosions, that's okay sometimes. But do that in the privacy of your own home and not in the face of someone that you disagree with. When it comes time to talk to the person that you disagree with, have a calm, reasonable, logical discussion and try to put yourself in their shoes and see the way they see. And then don't care about winning the discussion, because you're not going to change their mind. Listen to their perspective and try to understand where they're coming from, and then you collect that data and you put it against all the other data you've already collected, and you get to start to say, okay, like, this maybe is making me change my thoughts about something, or maybe it isn't. Maybe it's confirming something. It doesn't matter. The point is that we have a reasonable, logical discussion about those things. And so that's how we de-escalate. It works not just in, we've kind of moved this direction in the podcast the last few minutes, but certainly in these big cultural situations, these big political, racial, religious sort of discussions, it works. But it also works with your kids, and it works with your parents, and it works with your wife, and it works with your boss, and it works with your coworkers, and it works with your employees. Being able to put yourself in their shoes, understand where they're coming from, and having reasonable, logical conversations with them where you don't have to win is the key to true de-escalation. Because in the end, the person will walk away. This is what I found. When I do this well, and there's times when I definitely don't, but when I do it well, the other person walks away and says, I may disagree with Matt about X, but I really appreciate that he listened to everything that I said. And then he talked to me about it in a reasonable manner. And you don't get upset. You don't throw it back in their face because they think they're right. They don't know you're right, and they're arguing for evil. Nobody's doing that. And we recognize that, right. And you start to see people as humans, which have infinite amounts of value, regardless of where they're coming from, regardless of the demographic. By the way, I think regardless of their life choices, right? Like, I don't care if you're a drug addict or a prostitute, or like, you still have inherent amazing value as a human. As a human, you have value. And there is something that every single person can bring to the story, to give their outlook. And like, a lot of times I just need to shut the F up and listen and try to put myself there, right? So we have this unique perspective, you and I. We were raised in a poor Southern Baptist preacher's home. Well, we're white kids. We were homeschooled. We're kind of protected. Our mom and dad loved each other. They raised us well, right? We had a good childhood, even though we were broke. And so there were places where we were kind of behind the eight ball, and there were places where we did well. We were dealt better cards than most. And it gives us unique perspective on things, but it also doesn't mean that our perspective matters more than someone else's. I want to listen. And
That's right.
and beyond culture, that comes down to talking to my 9-year-old. When my 9-year-old is passionate about a thing, she's passionate about a thing for a reason. When she thinks she's right, or she cares, or she's like upset to the point of crying, it's because it matters to her. And I need to stop and listen. Like, okay, why does this matter so much? And we would all do better to do that. So there you go. There's our discussion on de-escalation. Can you imagine if we had across the board congressmen, a president, leaders of this country, media, who were skilled at de-escalation rather than let's stir up controversy to get eyes on us? Like, what a better place we would live.
There's a topic for an entire other podcast, I would guess.
Thanks, man. You guys have been listening to another episode of the Principles Podcast on the Barbell Logic. Again, Mondays, we've changed the schedule up a little bit. Mondays are the heavy content episodes, typically about barbell training. Thursdays are principles. No show on Sundays for the summer. And if you love the show, and for some of you, you're going to love the content stuff more on Mondays. For some of you, you're going to love the principle stuff more on Thursdays. Regardless, if you like the show, share it with a friend, share it with a family member. And we'd love a 5-star review. It makes a big difference for us to get 5-star review. I think we have about 940 reviews, and our average is still 5.0 on iTunes. So we'd love to get another 60 5-star reviews there and put us over 1,000. And I think that'd put us as the highest reviewed and highest rated show in the strength training niche. So we'd love to have that from you if you get a chance. It takes about 10 seconds to give us a 5-star review on iTunes. We'd love that. And we will catch you on Monday morning. See you then.